Now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for staying tuned to the second hour of the show. This hour of the show is brought to you by the Institute of Applied Energetics, where you can jumpstart your intuition today by downloading their free 50-page guide. So if you've been thinking about studying to be a medical intuitive counselor, or certified energy medicine practitioner, check out the courses offered by the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com. Also brought to you by soulhealer.com, where you can find out about the products and services I offer, including medical intuition evaluations, energy healings, and psychic readings. In this hour, we're going to be speaking with Katherine Chiljan about her book, Shakespeare Suppressed. So I'm curious where this is going to go, because I don't really know anything about Shakespeare other than Romeo and Juliet and that guy that talked to the ghost guy with the skull, who somebody said it was Macbeth. I don't know. So it's going to be an education for you and me. So let me tell you a little bit about Katherine and get her on the air. Katherine Chiljan is an independent scholar who has studied the Shakespeare authorship question for over 26 years. She has debated the topic with English professors at the Smithsonian Institution and at the Mechanics Institute in San Francisco. Chiljan served as editor of the Shakespeare Oxford newsletter and edited 2 anthologies, dedication letters to the Earl of Oxford and letters and poems of Edward, Earl of Oxford. So please welcome the author of Shakespeare Suppressed, Katherine Chiljan. Hi, Katherine. How are you?
Hi, Dr. Rita. I'm great. Thank you so much for the opportunity of looking into one of the greatest mysteries in literature.
Well, you're going to have to fill me in, because I didn't even know until, and I was told I had to say this, until Mark suggested you come on to the show. I didn't even know that there was a mystery. I mean, not that I keep up on Shakespeare or anything, but I didn't even know there was a mystery. But before we get into delving into the Shakespearean secrets and all of his dirt, it sounds like you have been interested in Shakespeare and literature for a long time. But what kind of got you started? What got you into delving into Shakespeare in the first place? I mean, he's been gone for a long time.
Yes. Well, the first play I read was Hamlet. And I remember just looking at the notes, and I was in my early 20s, and I noticed that they had a list of all the plays in the order that they believed they were written. However, next to each date that they think that they were written was a question mark. Every single date had a question mark, like they think it was circa 1600 with a question mark, or circa 1595 with a question mark. And I thought to myself, that's a bit odd. After 400 years, scholars still don't know when Hamlet was written or Romeo and Juliet. And so later on, I came across a debate on television between someone who was questioning the authorship of Shakespeare versus a Princeton professor. And I knew nothing about this topic at all, other than, Shakespeare was one of the greatest authors who ever lived. And the man who was questioning the authorship made point after point, perfect sense, giving evidence supporting his case. Meanwhile, the Princeton professor could only say to the man, who was a Harvard graduate, by the way, he wasn't stupid, all he could say to him was, "You're crazy, your theory is nuts, there's no evidence." All he could do is cast aspersions at this person without proving his own case for the traditional Shakespeare. And that's when, a red flag went off for me, and I read the other gentleman's book, and it just kind of lit a fire in me that, hey, we got to get the truth out here about the real man.
About the real man. Weren't his works published? I would think, if you are a writer, that you would write your whatever, and you would, like an author today, you send it to the publisher and they print it, or, if it's a piece of music, you hope that they will print it and distribute it. Weren't his works written and distributed or performed on stage, that there would be some kind of a documented beginning date?
Well, first off, let me say that there are absolutely no manuscripts in the handwriting of the great Shakespeare. We have no, and yet he wrote over 40 plays and many sonnets and other poems. Nothing in his handwriting, not even a letter, not even a personal letter has survived. Nothing in his handwriting. Yes, some of the plays were printed in his lifetime, but there is another problem, because if you look at the condition of these plays, they're clearly pirated. Almost every one of his plays that were printed in his lifetime were in bad condition. In fact, they have invented names for them. The size of the play, they were printed on smaller size pages. They call them quarto pages. So they call them the Shakespeare quartos. So the ones that are in good condition, they call the good quartos, and the ones that are in really corrupt condition are called the bad quartos. So they have good quartos and bad quartos. But pretty much none of these were derived from the great author's original. We know that because there's missing lines, there's messy text, there's wrong text. No play that we have of Shakespeare was from the author's original.
Do we have any of the originals?
Like I said, no, we do not.
So how do we know that the ones that we have are bad? Maybe they were just bad.
Well, there's every evidence that a lot of them were actually transcriptions of probably people in the audience, because a lot of the lines were, in some cases, misheard. And I don't have examples for you, but if you look at the text in, say, 1595 of Much Ado About Nothing or what have you, it would be very hard for you to follow because it is in such bad condition. Today's texts are the result of over 200 years of editing to make it readable and understandable. And there's still many, many lines in Shakespeare that they don't know what the true line is. That is a consequence of not having the original manuscript.
Now I'm getting kind of confused because so we have this person, this celebrated author that we look to as the enigma of language and poetry and playwright, and we don't really even know what he did.
Yes, we still don't know exactly when the plays were written. We don't know anything about his literary life. No one claimed to have met him in his lifetime. We don't have any evidence that he went to school. We don't have any payments to a writer named William Shakespeare, or we don't know, they say he was an actor, but we don't know any of his roles that he played. This is not true for other writers. We do have evidence of payment for writing. We do have their letters that have survived. Another incredible one is when the great author died, no one made a mention of it. No one noticed it. And yet this same man was described by critics, one critic who said that if the muses, who were the goddesses of the arts, if the muses could speak English, they would speak Shakespeare. Now, I can't imagine a more high evaluation of Shakespeare's greatness during his lifetime, and yet when he died, there was nothing. Nobody noticed it. That all of these absences raises red flags that there's something wrong about the man. Something is suspicious. And when you have to look at the contemporary evidence and see what the writers were saying about the great author, because we do have that evidence, and that's in my book, Shakespeare Suppressed.
Okay, so I need to let go of we don't even really know what the play was. I need to just let go of that line, and let's just kind of move. Okay, so based on your research, who was Shakespeare? Even if it's just this character, what do we know of him?
Well, if we look at the contemporary evidence, what the writers were saying about him, not always directly, indirectly, they were saying right off the bat that the name was a pen name. And that's what it was. But the problem is the man who was using the pen name, at the same time, there was another man with that same name who was born with that name. And he is the one today that we're attributing the greatest works in literature to. But that man, the man from Stratford, he was actually probably illiterate. That's one of the greatest ironies of all. But there were two different men named William Shakespeare during the same period who were involved with the theater. This man from Stratford, he was involved in the theater. But somehow, after their deaths, the two identities merged. And that's, again, something I try to explain, in my book. It is a little bit complicated. But the professors today will say, yeah, he was the man born in Stratford-on-Avon, and we think that he, maybe had, a seventh grade education, and then we think that he somehow became an actor, and we think that he somehow, became a writer. It's all like speculation, his literary career. And that's why, going back to what I originally said, why there's question marks for dates of all of the Shakespeare plays. It's just one huge speculation.
All right, question. And
Yes.
I think you'll get where I'm going. Based on the literary style, can you look at the body of works and attribute all of that body of works to the same individual? And what I'm thinking is they can look at the Bible and go, well, this part was written by P and this part was written by E, and they can kind of separate out authorship based on verbiage and terms used, et cetera, et cetera. So when you look at his body of works, can you ascribe all of it or a good portion of it to at least one individual?
Yes, I think
Shakespeare or not?
Yeah, the true author behind the pen name wrote all of them. But they are in various stages of development. Some, of course, the earlier plays are not going to be as magnificent as the later ones, of course, when he really had developed his craft, and a lot of things happened in his personal life that were reflective. Yeah, some of the early ones are Two Gentlemen of Verona and Taming of the Shrew, and Julius Caesar. Sorry about that.
Hi, person on the phone.
Yes, they should be calling me.
I know, at such an hour. That's what it's like, why are you calling me at this hour?
I know, but yeah.
Well, you're in California, so we have a time difference, so it's not that bad.
Another problem with trying to gauge the writing of the plays is you usually have a biography to put it up against. Like whenever I took a class for an author or a painter or whatever, the first class they did, they gave you the full biography of the man. I'm sorry. But with the Stratford man, we don't have any biography. So that's why they can't say, okay, well, he probably wrote Hamlet here and, King Lear there. They don't have anything because they have no life events to line it up with. And
was William Shakespeare the Stratford man or whoever? I mean, was he popular in his day, or was it not till after his death that he was discovered?
Yes, that was a great question. Nobody during the Stratford man's lifetime, nobody connected Stratford upon Avon with the great author. Nobody mistook him. It all happened after he had died. And he was given the authorship, and I believe for political reasons. They wanted to decontextualize the plays and mostly the sonnets of Shakespeare. I don't know if you're aware of those, but the sonnets tell a very fascinating story that was politically not correct at the time.
I mean, I don't even know. I mean, other than I've heard the word sonnet. Yeah. So what is a sonnet? And
yeah, a sonnet is a 14-line poem. And Shakespeare wrote 154 of them. And he really poured his life, his personal feelings inside these sonnets. And that has posed problems for the professors because a lot of what he says doesn't seem to line up with what the Stratford man would be. He describes himself as gracious, which is a term that nobility use, or Shakespeare used to describe nobility or royalty. Another great line from the sonnets is Sonnet 125, "Were it aught to me, I bore the canopy." Now, you probably don't know what that means, but I'll tell you what that means. Bearing the canopy meant being one of the 4 people to hold a pole of a canopy over the Queen Elizabeth I. To be somebody to hold that canopy over the Queen was a great honor. And yet here you have Shakespeare saying, "Oh, were it anything to me that I bore the canopy?" I mean, does that sound like somebody coming from humble origins like the Stratford man? Oh, it'd be the greatest honor ever. But it sounds like kind of a disgruntled courtier, not the Stratford man. So these are just tiny snippets out of the sonnets.
Well, and let me ask, so when you read them, in your opinion, they sound more personal in nature and not as if he was stepping into the shoes of this nobleman and then writing through his eyes. That wasn't your impression.
I'm sorry. Say that again?
In your observation of these sonnets,
yes.
Did it seem more like he was writing about himself and writing from his experience, or was he taking on a role or a character and speaking from that perspective?
No,
if I was a janitor, what would my life be like, and where would I be coming from?
Right. Well, that's what some of the professors would want you to think, that it was like a literary exercise. But no, these are very heartfelt sonnets where he's expressing love for a young man and love for the dark lady. These are intensely personal. And of course, they're written in the first person as well. There's no reason to doubt that he was talking about himself and talking about real people. In fact, they believe that the young man that he's lauding in these sonnets was a real person, the professor would tell you. And same with the dark lady, that she was a real person. But for some reason, they don't want the great author to be the real person, representing himself. It's kind of an odd paradox. Because it is not the profile of who they think it is. So anything that doesn't fit with the Stratford man, they just kind of ignore or put to the side. Yeah.
They do that in every area. Yeah. What was he writing about that was so controversial?
Well, the young man that he is praising and saying, he loves, if you read it in a certain way, of course, through symbolism, he's describing him as the son of the Queen Elizabeth I, and using all that symbology. And I believe that is probably the crux of the problem, because these sonnets were published, and they did not want people to know that Shakespeare was a nobleman. If they did know that, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry, I cannot talk. I'm on the radio. If they knew he was a nobleman, they would read into it that, oh, he is talking about the child of the queen. And she was known as the Virgin Queen. She did not have any children, supposedly. But Shakespeare seems to be intimating something else, another story. So I think ultimately that's what's behind it.
Well, that's kind of interesting. The sonnets were actually published, because it sounded like you said the plays really were never published, but the sonnets were published?
About half of the plays were printed. But like I said, they were in very bad condition. But yes, the sonnets were printed as well. But of course, with the pen name William Shakespeare. And
were they in as bad condition as the plays?
No, those were in very good condition. More than likely, they came from an original, I would think. But no, I'm not the expert in this, but it is a very clean copy. Yeah.
I just find that really interesting. But go ahead. Yeah.
Also, his two poems, very long poems called Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece, those were purposely printed with the name William Shakespeare. And those were in excellent condition. So we think that was from the author's copy as well. Even, a Shakespeare professor is going to say that the great author gave an original copy of that because it is in such wonderful condition.
With good grammar and good all that stuff. Okay.
Yes, with a minimum of flaws, but everything else is messy. Good and bad, but mostly not that great. But then years later, we got 20 more plays were printed for the very first time, and that book today we call it the First Folio. It was a collection of Shakespeare plays. That book is where the myth, in my opinion, of Shakespeare began. That is the first time that the name Shakespeare was associated with Stratford. And this is the root of the problem. Okay, so
talk about that. What does that mean?
Yes. Well, this book was published in 1623, and the Stratford man had been dead for about 7 years. And we have on the title page that very famous engraving, a black and white engraving of Shakespeare that I'm sure you've seen. That's really the only supposedly authentic image we have of the great author. And they put, the William Shakespeare on it. But a very curious thing is on the opposite side of the page. And that is a little poem written by Ben Jonson telling the reader not to look at this image. Read the book. So that was kind of right off the bat, there's a little tip-off that there's something not 100% right with this opening page. And then there are more opening prefatory pages, about 15 or 16 pages. And they contain poems dedicated to Shakespeare. And in one of the poems, there's the reference to Sweet Swan of Avon. You may have heard that. So there you have Avon. And then a couple pages later, there's another poem by another writer, and they make a reference to Shakespeare's Stratford Monument. Now, the phrase Stratford upon Avon, which is where Shakespeare professor will tell you Shakespeare was born, that phrase is nowhere in the book. But there is a monument in Stratford-on-Avon Church. And because of that association, that pretty much threw the authorship suddenly to Stratford-upon-Avon, even though there were several Stratfords during that time. But because of the word Avon on another page, they located Stratford-upon-Avon. And that's where it began. But during the Stratford man's lifetime, no one associated Stratford-on-Avon with the great author.
At the very beginning of the interview, you said that there were two William Shakespeares, and where you're talking about the Stafford man being one of the William Shakespeares. Who is the other guy?
Right. Well, the one guy was the man who was born with the name William Shakespeare, and he was from Stratford-on-Avon. He's the one the professors believe was the great author. Mm-hmm. And then there was the man using the pen name William Shakespeare. And an interesting fact about that is about half the time that the name was in print, there was a hyphen between shake and spear, which right off the bat is a description, noun and verb, and it makes you think of spear shaking, which during that period was another way of saying jousting or tilting, shaking your spear, because in the tilt, it's called a spear, when you're jousting. So the presence of that hyphen is an indication of a made name. Now, meanwhile, the Stratford man, the way he spelled his name, it was always with a short A, like Shakespeare, Shaxper, Shaksper, Shakespeare. He very rarely spelled his own name in documents, official documents, as we know the great author spelled his name. And he never had a hyphen in any of these documents. So, there's such an amazing separation between these two entities. And even contemporaries during that time mentioned that the name was a pen name. And the man using the pen name, they also described as someone of very high rank. And that's what we're getting. If you read the plays, he is somebody of exceptional education and experience. There have been many books written about how well Shakespeare knew Italy, places in Italy, not something that you could just go to a tavern and hear somebody talk about, actually having been there, and places in France, and his knowledge of the law, and his knowledge of languages, ancient Greek, things like that. These are all some subjects of someone who would have at least a university education. But there is no accounting for the Stratford man, how he acquired this education if he were the great author. So every way you look at it, it's pointing to a nobleman who was behind these works, because a nobleman would have the luxury of taking trips to Europe and getting the top education. And, the opportunity wasn't there for the Stratford man. If he were the great author, he would have at least have had some sort of notice by his family, even, that he was a writer. That's just not the case. It's always a blank.
In England at that point in time, was the last name Shakespeare? I mean, now if someone said, "Oh, my name is Rita Shakespeare," that everyone would look at you. But in that time, was that a fairly common surname?
Actually, there were several people named William Shakespeare during this period, besides, the man using the pen name and the man born with the name. Like, for example, in the state records, there's a man named William Shakespeare who was listed as being in the army. And he was from the same county as the Stratford man. And actually, other people have made lists of other William Shakespeares during this period, so it really wasn't that unique a name. But the great author needed a pen name because he was a nobleman. Noblemen were not supposed to be so deeply involved with the theater or with poetry. Those topics were considered frivolous. A nobleman or someone highly ranked should be helping the queen with her government, or in the military, or being an advisor of some sort. That is the true place. So during his lifetime, the true author did not want recognition that he was an author or deeply involved in the theater. He wanted it quiet. But after his death, that's the problem. He should have been credited with the great works after his death. There would have been no social stigma. But that's the problem. No one said a word when he died. And the authorship, a little bit later, was put on the Stratford man for, as I believe, it was political reasons.
But it sounds like it was put on that person years later and potentially out of ignorance.
Yes, it was. It was done years later. The real author, who I believe was the Earl of Oxford, he had been dead about 19 years. And the Stratford man had been dead about 7 years when this first folio book that I was describing came out. Throwing the authorship on Stratford. And that's where the injustice started. But before then, up until that period, nobody connected the great author to the Stratford man. Nobody. Not even his own family members. The Stratford man had a granddaughter. She lived until 1670. Now, at that point, I mean, Shakespeare was in, the stratosphere. I mean, he was very, very highly regarded. The world, England anyway, really lauded him. So, they had biographies back then. They wanted to know about great people, but nobody took a pilgrimage to Stratford-on-Avon while the Stratford man was there retired to ask him about anything.
And the grandchildren, even though they didn't even accept the claim to fame, even though they didn't know if it was true or not, or
they never spoke of their father or grandfather as being the great author. Nobody. It's none of the neighbors. No one seemed to think that. Even the town. The town never celebrated the great author as being his birthplace. So everywhere you look, it's like a wall. Other than that monument, which I believe was changed.
Well, when did they put the monument up, though?
That's another excellent question. It appears that the monument in the Stratford-on-Avon Church, which is a monument to Shakespeare, there's nothing in the inscription that outwardly says, in English anyway, that this is a poet or a writer. There's just one reference in Latin to Virgil, who was, an ancient Roman writer and poet, I believe. But yeah, so nothing in there outwardly says he was a writer. But it appears, if you look at documentary evidence, about 18 years after the Stratford man had died, someone made a drawing of this monument, and it does not look like today's monument. It looks totally different. And there were changes made in the inscription and in the face. But again, this is something that is not accepted. Even though you have documentary evidence that it looked different, the professor will tell you, oh, well, that man got it wrong because it doesn't look like what it is today. So it's kind of a circular reasoning. But that mentality happened all over the ancient world. I mean, I don't know if it was a common practice in the 1600s, but I know that in Egypt and in Rome and in a bunch of other cultures, they would just take stuff and kind of white out the other person's name and put their name on it. And it's like, poof, it's my monument now, or it's me in this piece of mythology, and would just take it over. Right. Well, there's every indication that the monument was actually to the Stratford man's father initially, and that they just completely kind of rubbed out the inscription and instead of it saying John Shakespeare, they just put Shakespeare. There's not even a first name on this monument in the inscription. So, the monument is a whole nother story in itself. It's really amazing. Everywhere you look, there's some sort of controversy about Shakespeare in any direction.
Well, there's controversy, in particularly if you try to link him with the Stratford man. You know, if you just say it was a pen name, then it just becomes a whole lot easier. And then the bigger question becomes, well, if it's a pen name, then who is the man behind the name?
Yes. Well, there's every evidence, contemporary evidence of writers saying, not openly like, yes, Shakespeare was a pen name, but in using classical allusions and things which were very prevalent during that period, of saying that he did use a pen name. And this is what is amazing to me, that the professors don't look at this obvious evidence. There is contemporary evidence, and that's what it's a whole chapter in my book. These are printed references by people who would have a better understanding of the great author was than today's Shakespeare professor. And if their case for the Stratford man was so solid, then why did they spurn a 40,000 pound reward to prove their case, which one of our Shakespeare organizations offered them? And they didn't even want to accept it. They didn't even want to even try. To me, that says, by default, they don't have a case.
When did this whole conspiracy, because that's what it kind of sounds like, this whole conspiracy theory thing start to emerge? I would think it wasn't an issue in his lifetime or shortly after. So when did all of these questions start to come up as to authorship?
Well, that's another very good question. The professor will tell you, oh, well, this is just a new controversy. No one ever questioned the authorship during his period. Well, that's not true. If you look in as early as 1640, that very familiar image of Shakespeare was printed in a book of Shakespeare's poems. And underneath that image was this line, and it said, "This shadow is renowned Shakespeare's?" with a question mark. So as early as 1640, they were questioning whether this image that was in that first folio book was actually the great author, right off the bat. And it wasn't until the 1850s when actually books were starting to be written about this controversy. But there were some, questions here and there very early on. And another great line, also in 1640, and this was in print by an anonymous writer, he wrote, "Shakespeare, we must be silent in thy praise." Why? Why would, in 1640, when he had been dead for probably about over 20 years, why do we need to be silent about praising him? So again, all of these are raising red flags that there's something that we don't have quite right about Shakespeare.
And if I'm hearing you correctly, the image that we have looks like somebody, but we don't know who necessarily.
Right. I believe it was a made-up image. And that's the very interesting thing. They could have printed this book of Shakespeare plays without an image. They could have just put William Shakespeare, put the pen name in there and left it at that. But they didn't. Instead, they put a face in there, a face that opposite in a poem by Ben Jonson tells you don't look at the face. So the face has been roundly criticized over the many years, that it's, a very poor rendition. And in my opinion, I don't know if you can recall the image, but he has a very high forehead and kind of strange looking hair and kind of two chins. And I believe he was meant to look like kind of a gentleman, but a monstrous gentleman. That, to me, that's kind of the only way that you could have the Stratford man. I know this sounds terrible, but be believable that he was the great author, because there's no education behind the Stratford man. How did he make this achievement? So in a way, you have to think of him as, like a Superman, an oddity of nature. And in a way, I think that that's what they were trying to depict, an oddity of nature.
See, now I'm trying to figure out which picture it is.
It's a famous.
It's the one that we see of him. Okay.
Yes.
Well, see, I want to go see that double chin, because I never would have looked at that. But yeah, he does have a big head.
Yeah.
And,
If you
he's
look
a cone head. It's yet another conspiracy. He's a cone head.
He's an alien. Yeah. Yeah. If you look under his ear, you can see a double line. And as some people in our movement think that it could actually be a mask that is being portrayed, a mask you can lift off. If you look at you have to look at it.
No, it's pretty obvious to see. I mean, there's this big line like it's a plastic mask, and he really did have hair, and the cranium of the fake mask just kind of sits on top of his hair.
Yeah, it looks like, it's pasted on hair, like it would be on, or...
It's a clown head.
Like a clown head, yes.
Oh, no, it's it. Ah!
But he's got this wonderful kind of gentleman-like color, and the Stratford man got his coat of arms during that period. His father did anyway, and he inherited it. And so he could call himself gentleman back then. So kind of, sort of in my opinion, he's the gentleman monster. But I have no problem with the Stratford man. This authorship was put on him. He had nothing to do with it. So he was kind of innocent in a way. Like I said, his family never claimed he was an author, and he himself never claimed he was an author. And there were several literate people during that period who knew the Stratford man, but none of them said that he associated him with a great author.
And you would think, people are people, regardless of whether it's today or in the 1600s. And if you have a friend or a neighbor who's famous, you name drop. That's what we do.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a big zero for that
big
town.
Big zero on that one.
That town started celebrating him as Shakespeare in the late 1700s. Not when he died. So.
Well, in his day, was he popular? We think of Van Gogh as an example. He cuts his ear off and he dies penniless. And now his paintings sell for millions of dollars. Did he publish these things and they just weren't popular in his day? I mean, same thing with Mozart. We treasure Mozart, but he died a pauper.
Yes. The great author was a nobleman, and he had money. Actually, he started out with a great deal of money inherited from his father, and he ended up actually, I wouldn't say in poverty, but he started out with over 100 estates, and he ended up with maybe one or two. He devoted his whole life to the theater and drama and poetry, and he purposely wanted to improve the English language. And we know that because he invented at least 2,000 words. That was his great passion. But because of social circumstance during his lifetime, he couldn't own up to it. After his death, he should have gotten credit. That's the problem. But it got divorced from him as I said, for political reasons. But he had a fantastic life story, the Earl of Oxford. And people who look at his biography are going to be so much more informed, so much more. Reading the plays are going to be so much more interesting because you're going to see life parallels in them. The life of Hamlet is almost the life of the Earl of Oxford, very similar incidents. And you read the sonnets, you're going to understand. The Earl of Oxford had a dark lady in his life who he was just crazy about. He had an illegitimate child by her. So everything is going to be so much more interesting if you have a real biography behind it. The Stratford Man, you started out from the beginning. You say you know nothing about Shakespeare, right? Well, I think most people don't know anything about Shakespeare because nothing is known about his biography. If he had one interesting point in his biography, I think you probably would know it, one that intersected with the works. Mm-hmm. But you don't have that for the Stratford Man. It's all 85% speculation because we just don't have any facts. We have the facts of a man who was a grain dealer and a seller of stone, and man who paid taxes and bought real estate. That's what we have the biography of as far as hard facts, but nothing of a literary nature.
All right, so I have to ask something that's like really off tangent here, but what kind of words did he invent? I just,
Yeah, I have a little list here.
I'd love to hear it. I'd love to hear it.
Eyeball, assassination, successful, laughable, lonely, gloomy, lackluster, employer. There's a few of them.
But I mean, those are words that are very common in our vernacular today.
Yes, and so many famous phrases, you know?
Well, yeah, that part I get. But words, I mean, there's, what they call sniglets, words that sound like words and should be words, but they really aren't words. I mean, I think some of those are great. Not that I could think of one off the top of my head, but a sniglet, I mean, that's a good one. It's a word that should be a word. It's even got a definition. Anyway, Moving back to our topic, but I was just curious. Why do you think it's important to set the record straight?
Well, first off, if you wrote the greatest works on earth, I think you would probably want credit too. That's simple justice for the great author. If you read his sonnets, he bemoans the fact that he is not going to be known. Like, for example, he's speaking to the fair youth. He says, "Your name from hence immortal life shall have, though I once gone, to all the world must die." So he seemed to know that he would not get credit. Now, the interesting thing, it's almost certain that the fair youth that he was addressing was the Earl of Southampton. Shakespeare dedicated 2 poems to the Earl of Southampton. So the names Southampton and Shakespeare will live forever because of those 2 poems were printed. Well, Southampton was a name, a real person. But what about Shakespeare? Wasn't he a real person? No, because Shakespeare was not his real name. That's why his name would not be remembered. And the author in his sonnets is bemoaning this fact. He was aware of it. So it puts you inside of the man. And, it's, in a way, tragic story, tragic ending. Not being able to claim the greatest works on earth.
Mm-hmm. But I would think you would get a certain amount of the reverie of it by knowing that you are the face behind the mask. Yeah. I mean, there are lots of people that write with pen names. So
yes, but they're always found out. But I think that the great author really thought that people would figure it out. But I don't think he expected that his works would be hijacked and pointed in the direction of the Stratford Man. I think that really probably would have shocked him.
Yeah. It would be a little bit insulting, I think. Yeah.
But as I said, the whole purpose of my book, and many people are in this movement. There's a lot of great books out there about this. we want to set the record straight and also to enhance your enjoyment of Shakespeare by having a real biography to match it against. And that's what you're going to get when you have the right man. And you're going to love the works even more.
Perfect. And, we are out of time. So we're just going to say cut. And if someone wants to get a copy of your book, Shakespeare Suppressed, The Uncensored Truth About Shakespeare and His Works, where should they go?
Well, I have a website, shakespearesuppressed.com, but also it's on Amazon. And also I would encourage your listeners to request it from your public library, because you can just put in the request and they'll buy it. And I believe that this is a reference work that should be in every library.
Agreed.
Thank you.
And so if they want to see, I always ask this one, if they want an autograph copy, if they get it off your website, do you sign all your books?
Yes, I will if they request. Yes. Mm-hmm.
See, and that's priceless. So, Katherine, thank you for coming on. I was a little nervous. I have to tell you, I was a little nervous coming on, but you were delightful, and this was good.
So were you. And so were you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, you are so welcome. Thank you very much, and I will talk to you again.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye. That's Katherine Chiljan. Her book is Shakespeare Suppressed. Her website is shakespearesuppressed.com. And next week, we're going to be speaking with Mike Barra about Ancient Aliens on the Moon 2. Or is it I...
Join host Dr. Rita Louise each week at this time for Just Energy Radio. Point your browser to www.justenergyradio.com for more show information and to contact Dr. Rita. Until next time, remember, it's all just energy.